Wow, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first in our M&A Pitfalls series. I'm Rebecca Lovell, the CEO of Denali Financial Consulting, and have spent the last 15 years leading and supporting technology startups here in Seattle. With me today is my colleague, our expert, Casey Stenzel. He is the CFO of TA Group Holdings and brings deep experience as a forensic accountant, working for companies such as Microsoft and leading M&A transactions in his prior life and for the last 8 years with TAG Group. Welcome, Casey. Thanks for joining. All right, so before we dive into the topic at hand, thank you for launching that poll. We'd love to learn just a little bit about you. If you could quickly answer, what brings you here today? Are you thinking about acquiring, being acquired, or just curious? Give that a moment to see who we are talking with today. All right. And then the next question for the group when we are ready is kind of the level of experience that you might have with this topic if you're approaching it for the first time. Casey and I want to make sure that we calibrate our remarks appropriately for the audience. Cheryl, can we launch that poll as well? Wonderful. Okay. So just to set the stage a little bit, we can't talk about all things M&A in this short session today. We will dive in to the topic of managing expectations. Just to give you a little bit of a flight plan for today, we will moderate questions for about 30 minutes or so and open it up to you. If you missed the announcement earlier and you have a burning question, please go ahead and put it into the Q&A and we will get to it either as it arises or at the Q&A portion towards the end. And we will wrap it up and send you on the road within the hour. All right, so Casey, let's just set some context. I know you have a really complicated matrix for value creation in M&A transactions, but for the group today, could you just sort of give us the broad categories of some of the success factors that you're looking at that would bring both parties to the table for an acquisition?
I think first and foremost, there needs to be a win-win scenario. We want to really spend time with people before we go down a path of either buying or selling a company and understanding their motivations, what life stage they're at. Are they looking to sell to retire? Are they in their mid-30s and now have young children and want to take chips off the table and for their future? So that process that we always start our deals with is an introduction, ideally face-to-face, fly them in, whatever we need to do, and really spend some time getting to know them and what their objectives are, what their family situation is, and quite frankly, so we can feel like these are people we can work with, that we could get along well with. That would Absolutely. Be step one for sure. And I think time after time, when we've done these things, it really just comes down to trust and making sure that we can go down a path where we end up being business partners. So that's the first and biggest item. And then, there's a wide variety of sellers. Some folks that have never considered doing a deal. Then there are others that are quite savvy and maybe this is their third exit. The differences are massive between those two sellers in that situation because there's a lot of education involved in just how does a deal work? Do you hire a broker? Do you not hire a broker? And I'm focusing primarily on small to mid-market deals. If you're with Microsoft and you're buying a company somewhere in the world, you've got a full corporate team, lots of lawyers, vendor integration folks, and it's a very big managed process. But what I've been doing for the last 8+ years is buying companies as small as 2 million in revenue up to 200, people kind of thing, an aqua-hire situation, things like that. So understanding and helping navigate them through that process is a lot of what we do. And I would say more times than not, we don't go down a path with a prospective seller just because it becomes clear that we have differing objectives. So that's right.
Absolutely. So certainly the human element or elephant in the room, the human element, understanding the people that are at the table and their motivations. And then there's, I think, your sort of textbook checklist of standard acquisition success factors, whether it is entering a new market from a product or a geography perspective, adding new customers, having some synergies, as it were, between the teams. Anything else in that sort of textbook checklist, just to, again, set the stage a little here?
Yeah, I think right off the bat, one of the things that we need to understand right away is the buyer or seller expecting a strategic investment or a financial one? And the difference is strategic is almost always going to command a much higher valuation, and it's more likely to be associated with a product or something that has recurring revenue. And then the case of a financial deal, we're looking at professional services business, quite frankly, and most normally. And those deals are not going to command as big of a multiple in the open market, simply because it's very heavily based on future performance. So that's one thing we need to assess right away. And then again, I'll bring up lifestyle because it's so important, which is, what is the end goal? Are the sellers going to stick with us for a period of time? Maybe there's an earn out in play, or do they just want to move on? And I'd say the vast majority of deals we've done in the last few years, we've not only encourage the sellers to stay with us after the deal was closed and the earnout was completed. And our success record there is, I think, almost 100%. I think it's probably 95% of the time, those former owners who sold to us are still employed with the tag companies. So that's fantastic. And some other things that we look at is most of our businesses are services businesses. We do have some products that we've rolled out over time, but generally speaking, we look for what we call a tuck-in, something that is very complementary right off the bat. It's something we could run ourselves on day one, and that is a big criteria for us. Is just how difficult or easy it would be to integrate two businesses. And that's very big. We look for leadership talent. Sometimes the owner or a partner have been the only sellers, the only leaders in the business for the life stage. So if they go, then there's a concern, obviously, that, who's going to sell the service or product in that case. So, and acquiring young leadership talent is always important for everyone. We look at customer concentration within a seller's business. A lot of firms in the greater Seattle area have Microsoft as their single biggest customer, with 80+% customer concentration, which is great because it's pretty predictable, and those long-standing relationships have tested time. But when you go to sell your business and you have so many eggs in one basket, it scares away a lot of folks. I'd say maybe half a prospective buyer list will not participate just because of that. So it's a good and a bad thing. We also look really heavily at, is this business scalable once we acquire it? That's huge, quite frankly. We've had some situations in the past where we either invested or purchased a business that over time we realized the only way to grow was just to produce more widgets, just have more workers. And, it just was more project-based than recurring in nature. So valuations are very different for those two types of businesses. And then you got to really look under the sheets a little bit more in terms of, were these owners working in the business or on the business? Working in the business would be, they're just doing the same thing they've been doing for 10 straight years, and it's worked and they've made money. but they're not really working on the business, meaning going outside their comfort zones and hiring, a stud new CEO or a new salesperson, or to break into new lines of business and modalities. So that's a big part of what we do before we go down a path that's pretty straightforward, and we can go into more
Mhm.
detail if you'd like.
No, that's a great way to set the table. Certainly understanding both strategic and financial exits, and it's good to know that as an acquirer, you're looking to bring more to the party than just a cash infusion. That really help grow the business and make sure you're not destroying value by way of the leadership team along the way. So I think what might be really instructive today is to share a few case studies, and as you describe those success elements, a really kind of simple, straightforward one comes to mind from my own past. And for those of you who are familiar with the technology news site and community called GeekWire, in our very early days, in fact, the year that we launched, 2011, we had the opportunity to absorb or acquire a beloved property in Seattle known as Seattle 2.0, which was launched back in 2006 and had these amazing community elements like a job board and 3 really incredible signature events that brought the community together. And it felt at the time, and I still believe it was kind of that Reese's peanut butter cup combination where we had a really similar market. We were approaching, and serving startups and technologists in the greater Seattle area. We brought the journalism and that reputation. And then the community element was just a wonderful addition to our portfolio. But to your point about the human element and trusting relationships, I believe the reason that deal got done and had successful outcomes is because we knew and respected each other really well. The owner of that business, Marcelo Cabucci, I was actually one of his original bloggers when he launched his website. He knew our investor, Donathan Spazzato, really well. And so we had just a really straightforward transaction. And we understood deeply that it wasn't just about a bit of a financial win for Marcelo. We were all aligned in our vision around creating value for the community and making sure the incredible legacy of Seattle 2.0 lived on and thrived in its new home at GeekWire. So understanding, I think, both the financial considerations and the non-financial considerations, like digging deep into our souls, what we wanted success to look like. We had great alignment. And if any of you have enjoyed Startup Day or the GeekWire Awards, that's the origin story. It came from our Seattle 2.0 acquisition. So that one, again, really simple, pretty straightforward, checks a lot of the boxes I think you described, Casey. But in your vast experience, even when you sort of check those transactional boxes and go through your matrix, things can still go wrong, as you get into kind of the aftermath and the integration. So if you need to change some names to protect the innocent, I would love for you to share just a quick cautionary tale to help folks understand some of the pitfalls as they engage in an acquisition.
And I'd start with, we like to talk about pitfalls because it's kind of fun, but also because it's very instructive of what not to do. And you can do all the due diligence in the world and still have things go awry. And we one company that we own 50% of, starting back in 2011, definitely on the high tech scene, more of a services firm than a product firm. We decided that we would be bigger and better together with another local Seattle company that was a little more product heavy than our services business, which had to do with digital agency kind of work. And in that scenario, we somewhat quickly moved to do a 50-50 merger with that company, and similar size and revenue and employees. And what we found right away, and we were closing this deal in late July 2013, I believe, and the integration was just much slower than we had hoped, and we were doing it all ourselves. We hadn't included any advisors at all. And the first big emergency issue that happened that we didn't foresee is that we were having trouble getting invoices out because of integrating 2 separate accounting systems, processes, the way we build versus the new company that merged with us. And all of a sudden we found that we had pretty much maxed out our line of credit in the first 3 months, and we needed a cash call. And that was the first time that we really tested our new relationship with the founder of the company who had joined us. And he was shocked and dismayed, and it began a bit of a legacy of having conversations that were uncomfortable often. We didn't necessarily have all the same objectives and goals and those things. And over time, that just, it kept rearing its head at times. Even though we all liked each other very much and spent time together outside of the office, when it came down to putting up your own money when needed, you really learn what people's true motivations are, and they're very hard conversations. And sometimes, it just doesn't work out. So in that case, really, there was a couple of things also that stood out. The merger was approximately 100 new people versus about 60 that we had originally. After about 6 months, I think we were down to like 40 of those 100, because they just either didn't have the technical chops we had expected, or they decided it wasn't the right fit for them. So what was a 50-50 deal at first became tilted heavily to the original company. And at the end of the day, that was even more pronounced 2 years later, where there was maybe 10 people from that original deal. So we ultimately we're doing okay. We were growing. We had some great customers, but at the end of the day, that the other partner that merged with us just wanted out, and it's pretty hard to do that without recapitalizing the business or taking on loans or term notes to pay that former owner. So we ended up going down the path of hiring a broker, independent broker, to find a buyer. We did a transaction by a publicly traded company. It was a good financial deal for us, but we were always left with what if it had all really worked and we had continued to grow that business and become the acquirer of other similar tuck-ins ourselves. So it doesn't always work.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think you aptly flagged the bumpy road that integration can be, whether it's a cultural integration or a technical integration. But what I get from that is that the integration process itself revealed a deeper issue around kind of the founders' expectations and communication. So that's an interesting takeaway. But as you look back with 2020 hindsight, even having done the due diligence you did, what might you have done differently, do you think?
Probably spent a little bit more time with the new partner himself and his leadership team. I know that there were a lot of folks who knew each other from both sides, but we really hadn't gone deep enough to understand and carefully plan out the integration process, and what systems and tools to use, and those basic things that ultimately just took our eye off the ball in terms of getting invoices out to customers and getting paid on time. And it reached, kind of a crisis level. But I think it was just over time that we learned that, our former partner just had very different ideas about what he wanted out of life.
Right. Now, and if you could sort of put the entrepreneur hat on a little bit here, I know that you were all friends and cared for each other going into the deal, which feels necessary but not sufficient in something this complicated. Anything perhaps the founder might have done differently at the onset? Because over time, you all ended up perhaps losing out on a bigger win for yourselves, for your teams, certainly, and for the market. And any advice you might have given him or others in that kind of a situation?
Off the top of my head, that's a tough one, because it was not a stark contrast. It was very subtle, and it was it was probably 3 or 4 really intimate conversations with the owners, where we really learned more and more over time, just where his head was at with respect to his family and his security and all of those things. And it just didn't, it didn't work for us. So it was amicable. And again, we did an excellent deal with a publicly traded company. It all worked out great. But there was a lot of time lost and money spent that, we'd like to have back.
Absolutely. And I think, the nuance is where the art is of the deal. And some of that is going to evolve. People's needs and expectations will change over time. And businesses change over time. And what comes to mind for me is another example from kind of Seattle startup lore. For those of you who knew Picnic back in the day, just a really user-friendly picture editing tool. I was a huge fan. The founders ended up selling that company to Google. And this was back in 2010. If you remember back to when Google Plus was kind of a thing, the leadership at Google is really leaning into building out that portfolio, and frankly went on a bit of an acquisition spree. At the time, everything looked pretty good, right? It seemed like there was some alignment between this photo editing tool and where Google Plus was going. By all public reports, it was a nice financial outcome. And then lo and behold, a couple years later, Google had a bit of a strategic shift, ended up winding down the Picnic business, and literally millions of Picnic customers cried out in agony, right? So when you think about the stakeholders in a deal, it's not just the founders or owners of the business and the teams involved, but the stakeholders include your customers. So kind of not surprising that same year, 2012, the Picnic folks got the band back together, left Google, and launched PicMonkey, which is, as they launched, they said it was Picnic with 67% more monkey. So again, it's a beautiful, easy to use photo editing tool that's on a rocket ship itself. And so interesting to kind of look back. While the outcomes initially may have sort of checked those boxes of financial success, I think if you ask the founders today, and some of them have been very transparent about it, if they dug deep into what their motivations were, a financial outcome was only one of them. Building an amazing business for their customers and growing that business was definitely another one. And it turned out Google wasn't the strategic home that they thought it would be, right? So again, hindsight is 2020. Might they have done the deal? Who's to say? But they're at it again with PicMonkey. I'm a fan. Check it out. Anyway, just another example of the multitude of nuances and non-financial considerations in that kind of an undertaking. So can you share, again, from your repertoire of successful deals, a win-win-win, and let's focus on some of the best practices that we might distill from there.
Yeah, so I think, as everyone knows, we did a deal to acquire 100% of Denali Financial Consulting in December.
True story.
And that was, and maybe it's just because I'm an accountant. The seller was an accountant, or is an accountant. That it was the cleanest, quickest, easiest deal we've done, because life stage was super clear. Chris and Janae wanted to exit at some point for retirement. They brought the business to a point where it was very stable, 100 plus customers. And being an accountant, doing things like due diligence went hyper quickly because he was so organized and was I think the second I created a Dropbox for due diligence, he filled up all of our requests like in 40 minutes. That sometimes can take a couple of weeks for other companies. So having all that and just really beautiful spreadsheets, beyond beautiful. We were all very clear on the outcome and why we were doing this deal. Accurate data is super, super important for us on any deal. Knowing that they have good systems and tools and financial controls is huge. So that was just like a given. The biggest thing that made it fun and exciting, and makes it fun and exciting going forward, is this business is super scalable. Right now, they provide accounting services on an outsourced basis, bookkeeping on up to CFOs. But the fact of the matter is we can be doing many more lines of business out of this company, and that's the plan. There are a lot of modalities and natural tuck-ins and add-ons that that we can do with Chris and Janae going forward, and yourself, Rebecca, and we can light this thing up and grow it substantially in a short period of time. The addressable market's huge for what we're doing here, and there's no shortage of demand at any time the economy's up or down. It's always there. So that one was extremely clear to us. And it, I think from the time we started talking, it was, I think, early November, and it was done basically before Christmas. So a unique deal. Again, it just felt win-win all along. And just super excited about the prospects of where we're going with that company.
Well, full disclosure, I'm super excited as well, having recently joined the team. But I think in terms of general takeaways, having that meeting of the minds where there were just such clear communication channels, and sort of you both spoke the language of accounting, I can only imagine that reduced kind of the barriers to the transaction, given that you were on the same wavelength there. You've pointed in other examples to life stage and the life stage of the business, not just the owners, as being kind of the right time to think about adding some extra resources to get a little bit more of that hockey stick type of scale, where sometimes these businesses can only scale with human capital. So certainly a lot of strategic wins in terms of your matrix of success factors, but managing expectations of everyone involved, I think, is, if you have one takeaway from this session, it's clear and transparent communication, so everyone understands mutual expectations. Otherwise, as we have heard, disaster may ensue despite all the best intentions.
And offices, I would add.
Yeah, not to scare anyone off, but it's not for the faint of heart, certainly. Well, we do have a good group that's assembled now, and I want to make sure that we are leveraging the Q&A. I do see a question from one of our participants, Taylor, for Casey. How do you determine and negotiate valuations for different businesses?
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a favorite topic of mine, as I'm dealing with this all the time. You get, again, top level, high level. Is it a strategic deal? Is it a financial deal? Very different valuations ensue. We've had a product that was that we sold to a publicly traded company a few years back that ran a product that captured 911 data and pretty much owned a big market share for being a small product and small company, where that valuation ended up being massive. I mean, it was what, 4 times top line revenue for a company that was relatively small, but the value was strategic to the buyer, who could then plug that product, that component in their stack, their tech stack. And so for strategic deals, you will get typically significantly higher valuations versus a financial deal. So I deal primarily with services businesses, staffing, consulting, IT, et cetera, where it really is about showing a pattern of repeated profit and or EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization, is a common cash flow indicator. Looking at even adjusted EBITDA is also helpful if the owners are running other costs of their company that are removed for the purposes of doing a sale. But generally speaking, a very solid, let's say a financial staff or just a staffing firm would typically, that's in good shape, typically command between 6 and 8 times EBITDA as a multiple. If you are perhaps doing higher bill rate work, you're an IT consulting company and you've got in excess of 10 million in EBITDA, you could be looking at 10 to 15 or 8 to 15 times EBITDA. as the multiple. So the takeaways is a strategic deal is priced quite differently than a financial deal. And you can use a million benchmarks to rationalize a specific valuation. It is a lot of art. It's definitely science, but there's a lot of art. There's a lot of ways that you can structure a deal, and specifically the vast majority of professional services deals involve some amount of cash upfront at close, and then requires a 2 to 3 to 4 year earnout for the sellers to ensure that the buyer gets what they paid for. And that's very typical. And I will just point out as a notation that right now, where we are in 2021, and it exists in 2020 as well, is we're in a bubble right now in terms of pricing. Everything is hyperinflated values. I think there's so much private equity money. It's like over 3 trillion still on the bench and not being utilized, that folks are able to sell right now at just record high levels, even if they don't even, they haven't shown or proven the cash flows, because more times than not, they will tend to value the future cash flows versus kind of where you're at and where you think you're going to go. So we tend to kind of shy away from deals that are overly leveraged on future performance. It's just hard to justify even 30-40% of cash up front if you just have a very high valuation. So I hope that answers the question, Taylor, but there's definitely lots of benchmarks. There's, you can use an investment banker or an independent banker to help justify and show comps and things like that. And it's a good indicator, but at the end of the day, it's just agreement between what the buyer and seller wants to do. It's like buying a house. I mean, if you want to buy a house in Issaquah right now, it's crazy high, really hard to get in. And there's no real rhyme or reason other than there's great demand right now, and they can get, 20, 30, 40, 80% more than they thought they could. So it's no different in business, really, is what I'm getting at.
Great, thank you. So we're in a bubble, a lot of PE money on the bench. You described some strategic scenarios where it could be anywhere between 3 to 15 times EBITDA. Good stuff if you happen to be in the market for a strategic acquisition. We have one more question in the chat so far for Casey from Justin. What are the frequently overlooked items that complicate closing if not addressed earlier in the process? Thank you, Justin.
Well, I think at the heart of any deal and closing, it just gets to a point where it's an emotional decision. And that's the hardest part for a lot of folks. Expectations are made, and in some cases where, we've completed due diligence, we've been running a parallel path of creating the purchase documents and doing due diligence. And maybe we find something that is a bad indicator, like a key leader is going to leave at the conclusion of the deal, or something where you need to potentially revise the terms somewhat. And it always comes to a point where there's some hard conversations, and it can get quite emotional. And that is really, it's really a hard spot sometimes. It can be easier in a situation where the life stage is clear, they're looking to exit or retire. I mean, and versus I think where it's harder is when you have someone that's selling at a relatively young age, they got a lot more years to work. It's a bigger deal in terms of how you structure the deal and the earnouts and all of that stuff, so that, they can have security in their own financial life and but still continue in the workforce. So occasionally you have some situations too where an employee that you acquired through a deal leaves and wants to compete or do something along those lines. Those are where you can kind of fall down in that process.
Thank you, Justin. Did that answer your question? All right, we've got another question in chat. Oh, all right. We're getting specific here. Was Combat Flip-Flops a merger or acquisition? Could you give a brief overview of the strategy and performance of the investment?
That one is pretty clearly an investment. And for those folks that have met Matt Griffin or Griff, and his partner Andy Lee and folks, or Donald Lee, excuse me, that was a passion project, quite frankly, because our chairman, John Sirkew, was an Army Ranger prior service member. He was in the same unit as Griff, just years apart. He was in Issaquah, John's in the Issaquah area. So they had a connection. They needed some funding. It was a fairly small investment at the time, but it was meaningful. And then over time that relationship grew, and we put a little bit more money in. We provided back office services for them for quite a while. And then we hit, the epic moment of actually taking Combat Flip-Flops to Shark Tank and getting 3 of the Shark Tank folks invested. At the end of the day, and behind the scenes, it was very fascinating, but only Mark Cuban stayed in. And through that, though, there were some great benefits. Like they provided a bookkeeping process for our person, and did some things there. And it's just been fun. We would love it if it was much bigger and grown crazy numbers and all that, but it's grown steadily. And I think the biggest thing is they've made it profitable after years of really trying to make that happen, given that their commitment is to basically involve production in places that are dangerous to do that in. So, Laos, Venezuela, Afghanistan, et cetera. But that was their part of their motto and their passion.
So Casey, the name is fairly descriptive, and nobody gives the elevator pitch like Griff does. But for those of us who don't know Combat Flip-Flops, can you give the quick one-liner of what it is they do?
They make cool shit in dangerous places.
There's a really interesting value proposition around upcycling and distressed countries. And so I think there's a real social impact element to the business, both environmental and from a workforce perspective. And clearly, as you mentioned, great alignment between John Sirkew and the founders of Combat Flip-Flops. A couple of the other investments in the TA Group portfolio that I'm excited about include 98.6 and Evernew, some local favorites. I want to make sure that we are getting to any other questions from the group. We can certainly give you a little, hang on, here we go. We can certainly give you a little time back in your day. But I'd love to, barring extra questions, I'd love to get, any parting words of wisdom or warnings, Casey, equally helpful, I think, whether you are a buyer or a seller in a potential M&A transaction.
There's 2 ways to answer that. If you've never done a deal, it probably doesn't hurt to bring in an advisor. It can be informal or formal. It is a little difficult when we go to do a deal and the seller never done anything like that, and it's extremely foreign. It can be very uncomfortable. It can be scary. It doesn't always work, obviously, but I think that is juxtaposed with those who have done deals, do understand the expectations, and in that case, you're really looking at, do we like and trust these people? I mean, that's if that happens, you're 50% of the way there right off the bat. A lot of our initial conversations, 50-60%, don't result in further activity, and there's lots of motivations for that. It could be they just didn't think that we would, have the same values or objectives and things. It's a very human process. And it's matchmaking, and then, you know, once you're done with the deal, we're all married, you know, we're all family, and it's a pretty big deal. I think the thing I'm really proud of, in the last three and probably the most significant deals, the founders, who sold to us are still working for us. In the case of some, have been working with us for now 5, 6, 7, 8 years after the deal was completed. They chose to stay versus going off and rebuilding another staffing firm or some other kind of business. And that's because, you know, we have a great company culture, and we have a lot of fun, and we play hard, work hard, and the portfolio as a result has just grown and grown and grown. And we can, you know, have 10 more podcasts on all the reasons why that works. Everything from, you know, the most recent success of our company, New S Group Staffing, which has risen to the occasion and deployed hundreds and hundreds of crisis nurses all over the country since April 1st. And we were moderately in that business prior to COVID hitting, and it has completely transformed our New West business, but also the whole portfolio. I mean, it's tripled in size, and it's been amazing how people have risen to the occasion. And you know, that's a whole nother podcast in itself.
Absolutely. Timing and providing the right service at the right time has got to be a huge element here. We did have one more question come in under the wire, and it's a good one. What's your favorite or most important question you ask business owners or potential sellers?
I like just to simply ask, what do you want? Like, what's your win? You know, do you have a valuation in mind? What are you going to do after the deal's over? And just being very open and transparent about that to make sure that we can, you know, go down that journey together, and just being very honest and upfront. It doesn't work typically to complete a deal where you don't, you know, quite frankly, first impressions is huge. You like them right off the bat. They have shared experiences. Maybe we have shared, you know, friends and contacts. That is all part of the chemistry of bringing a deal together. It's really, really important. There's lots of deals and folks we talk to where after 30 minutes, we're ready to go because it's just never going to work. The one other little tidbit I'll just throw out there, because I've been thinking about this a lot. A couple of times we've had really good opportunities to acquire privately held businesses where during due diligence, we find that they have 64 shareholders, and it's really, you know, a mom and pop shop, but they've allowed friends and family to come in and given them convertible debt notes. And all of a sudden you go to close a deal like that, it is impossibly hard at times because you need consent from all of them in some cases, especially if they have, you know, a note or something. And that has prevented at least 2 or 3 really pretty big deals in the past that we've worked on, just because it's just so overly complicated. And if one significant non-operating shareholder doesn't want to do it, then it doesn't happen. So keeping ownership tight and with the owner operator is very important.
Absolutely. And I can say, as we wrap this up, I'll assure all of you that Casey, being the forensic accountant he is, has a really complicated, you know, value creation matrix that has everything you would expect from an MBA textbook and more when it comes to multiples and EBITDA and scalability, customer, suppliers, you name it. You may be surprised and I'm delighted that you're now talking to a couple of financial folks who've spent the last 45 minutes talking about feelings. This is real. The human element, the blending of teams to create a bigger family, and the integration of cultures and management of expectations is not to be underestimated. So hopefully that was one of the biggest takeaways you got from us today. I would love to tee up again. There's so much we could talk about, but this is just the first in a series. Our next event will be a month from now, March 18th, and it's the pitfall is how to avoid wasting your time in an M&A conversation. You'll see the link to register in the chat. With that, thank you, Casey. Thanks all of you for your engagement, your great questions, for showing up today, and make it a good one. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.